Captain James was a soldier like no other. He had seen many battles, fought countless enemies, and survived where many others had not. But this mission was different. His orders were simple: patrol the outskirts of the planet Droner 7, a desolate world on the edge of known space. The planet had been abandoned after a failed war, and now it was nothing but a wasteland. No life, no civilization, just endless dust and ruin. As he trudged through the barren landscape, his boots crunching on the dry ground, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled across the empty plains, kicking up dust that swirled in the air. His visor tinted as the sun beat down harshly, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. For a soldier who had faced danger more times than he could count, this eerie silence was unsettling. He checked his communicator for any updates, but there was nothing. The only sound now was the steady hum of his boots against the ground. James was starting to wonder if the mission was a waste of time. Just as he turned to head back to his dropship, something caught his eye. It was a faint, blinking light in the distance, just a tiny glimmer among the craggy hills. The light pulsed erratically, almost like a distress signal. Intrigued, James squinted through his visor. There was no sign of any friendly ships in the area, and no reports of distress. Still, his instincts kicked in. He had to check it out. No soldier ever ignored a potential threat or a call for help. Without thinking twice, he set off toward the light, his boots kicking up more dust as he moved. The further he walked, the more the light grew stronger, until it was undeniable. It was a signal. But from where? The barren landscape didn't seem to offer any clue. Was it coming from something or someone? As James approached the source, his heart began to pound. In the distance, through the haze of dust and heat, he saw a large object lying wrecked on the ground. It looked like a ship, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen. The shape was alien, sleek, and unlike the metal structures he was familiar with. The ship's exterior was damaged, with scorch marks and jagged edges. It was as if it had crash-landed here in a desperate attempt to escape something. He quickened his pace, his hand instinctively resting on the weapon holstered at his side. His mind raced. Who was the ship's pilot? Were they still alive? And if so, what did they want? There was no time to waste. He had to investigate. As James reached the wreckage, he paused, scanning the area for any signs of life. There was nothing, only the wreck of the ship and the scattered debris around it. But then, a faint sound broke through the silence. A weak cry. It was soft, almost drowned out by the wind, but James caught it. It was a voice. Someone was still alive. His pulse quickened as he rushed toward the sound, hoping he wasn't too late. He rounded the side of the wrecked ship and froze. There, lying on the cold ground, was what he had feared most: a wounded, abandoned alien. The figure was small, fragile, and looked barely conscious. Her skin glowed faintly with a strange, soft blue light, and her features were delicate and alien. She had long, thin arms and legs, with slender fingers that seemed to twitch weakly as if trying to move. Her face, though full of pain, was hauntingly beautiful, almost ethereal. Her large, wide eyes fluttered open for a moment, locking with James' gaze. She was alive, but just barely. James took a cautious step forward, his mind racing. What was this creature? Why was she here? And who or what had left her for dead? He knelt beside her, his heart pounding. He had never seen anything like this before. The alien was clearly injured, her body battered by the crash, her breathing shallow and uneven. James hesitated, his hand hovering just above her. He had no idea what she was, or where she came from. Was she hostile? Would she attack if he helped her? His fingers grazed the alien's skin. It was cold to the touch, but there was a faint pulse, a tiny sign that she was alive. His instincts as a soldier kicked in. He couldn't leave her here to die. She might be alien, but she was a living being, and he had taken an oath to protect and defend life. His decision was made. He carefully lifted the alien girl, cradling her fragile form in his arms. Her body felt light, but her injuries were severe. He needed to get her back to base, to safety, and fast. But there was one problem. He was deep in enemy territory, and getting back to his dropship without drawing attention would be a challenge. As he began to carry her away from the wreckage, James couldn't help but glance back. The wreck of the ship, with its strange markings and alien technology, was a mystery he couldn't solve right now. But something told him that this alien girl was just the beginning. This encounter was no accident. Whatever had happened to her, and whatever had brought her here, was about to change everything. As James made his way back toward the base, the weight of the situation began to settle on him. The alien girl, who had no hope, was now in his arms. He didn't know what awaited them, but one thing was certain. This was just the beginning of an adventure far greater than anything he could have imagined. And as the horizon loomed ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that the universe had just become a much more dangerous place. James carefully made his way through the desolate landscape, carrying the injured alien girl in his arms. The weight of the situation settled heavily on him. His mind raced as he wondered about the creature he was now responsible for. Her frail, glowing body was unlike anything he had ever seen before. She wasn't human. That much was clear. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, and her skin had a faint shimmer to it, as though she wasn't entirely from this world. He kept moving, the wind howling through the barren wasteland, but it felt as though the planet itself was silent, almost watching. His every step was deliberate, mindful of the weight he carried. The girl's shallow breaths were all he could focus on, and he couldn't ignore the feeling that time was running out. Every second that passed without proper care for her injuries, every minute he was exposed to the harsh conditions of this planet, increased her chances of fading away. The trek back to base was longer than he had anticipated. As he moved, he kept his eyes peeled, watching for any sign of danger. His communication device remained silent, and the planet felt even more desolate the deeper he ventured. He had no idea who or what had attacked her, but it was clear that she had been abandoned. The thought gnawed at him. Why had she been left here to die? Was she alone? Or was there something far more sinister at play? As he approached the edge of the crater where his base was hidden, his thoughts continued to race. The base was a small, isolated outpost, a strategic location set up to monitor the surrounding area for any unusual activity. No one was expecting him back so soon. He hadn't reported in yet, and he knew the base commander wouldn't be thrilled about a soldier showing up with an injured alien. The risks were high, but he couldn't let this girl die. Not on his watch. James finally reached the base's secure entrance, a steel door that hummed with life as it opened for him. Inside, he quickly scanned the room for anyone. The base was quiet, no sign of the usual bustling soldiers or technicians. He hurried through the hallways, his thoughts solely focused on the girl in his arms. The medical bay wasn't far, but the feeling of being watched lingered at the back of his mind. Once inside the medical bay, James gently placed her on one of the examination tables. The soft hum of the room's machinery filled the silence, and he quickly began to assess her condition. The girl was in bad shape. Her injuries weren't just physical, they seemed almost otherworldly. Her limbs were covered in deep cuts and bruises, and there were signs of electrical burns across her skin. Her breathing was labored, and her body temperature felt dangerously low. The medical equipment was designed to treat human injuries, not alien physiology, and James wasn't sure where to begin. His mind raced for answers, but there was nothing in his training that could prepare him for this. He had to act quickly. He knew if he didn't do something soon, she wouldn't make it. He pressed a button on the nearby panel, activating the base's emergency medical system. A soft voice filled the room, instructing him to input the necessary parameters. James hesitated but typed in the details. Alien life form, unknown species, severe injuries. The system whirred to life, but as it began to scan her body, it gave an error. The system couldn't identify her species. Of course it couldn't. He was dealing with something completely foreign, something the system had no way of processing. Frustration boiled inside him. What if he was too late? What if the girl died before he could figure out how to help her? A sudden, weak groan pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced down at the girl, and for the first time, he saw her eyes flutter open. They were enormous, glistening with a strange, almost otherworldly color, an iridescent shade of blue. She blinked slowly, as though trying to focus on her surroundings. James stood still, unsure of what to do next. He had no experience dealing with this kind of situation. Her voice was weak, a soft whisper that barely registered. Where am I?" James was taken aback. The voice wasn't what he had expected. There was a depth to it, an alien cadence that sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't know how to respond, but instinctively he answered, his voice calm and steady, hoping to reassure her. "You're safe," he said softly. "I found you. You were hurt. You're at a military base. Can you tell me your name?" She took a slow, shaky breath. Her eyes closed for a moment, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, her gaze was locked onto his, and this time there was a flicker of recognition. A small, weak smile curled at the corners of her lips, though it quickly faded as pain seemed to overtake her. I am Lyra," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm from Virex." James was taken aback. Virex? He had never heard of that planet. But that didn't matter right now. What mattered was getting her through this. Lyra's fragile form seemed so small and delicate on the medical bed, yet there was something about her, a strength in her eyes, that told James she had endured more than he could ever imagine. As she struggled to stay conscious, James knew that whatever story she had, it was one that was about to change everything. He had questions, many of them, but they would have to wait. Right now, Lyra needed help, and he was the only one who could give it to her. But in the back of his mind, one question lingered. What had happened to her ship, and why had she been left for dead on this forsaken planet? Something wasn't right, and James had a feeling that this encounter was only the beginning of a much larger, much more dangerous journey. The days that followed were tense and filled with uncertainty. Lyra's condition improved slowly, but every hour seemed like an eternity. James stayed by her side, doing his best to care for her, though he felt increasingly out of his depth. The medical bay was equipped with state-of-the-art technology, but nothing here could truly prepare him for treating an alien. Still, he couldn't leave her alone. Lyra, though weakened, was remarkably resilient. Her once delicate form had begun to regain some strength. Her breathing became more stable, and her wounds, though severe, were slowly healing under the care of the advanced medical systems. But her mind, it seemed, was still lost in another world. She often drifted in and out of sleep, murmuring words in a language James didn't understand. At first, he'd been alarmed, thinking she was in pain, but over time he realized she was simply speaking to herself, her voice soft and almost melodic. James couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her, what had brought her to this unknown, barren planet. He tried to ask her, but every time he did, she'd either fall asleep or retreat into silence, her gaze distant and full of an unspoken sorrow. It was late one night when the answers began to come, but not in the way James had expected. He was sitting by the bed, his eyes tired but focused on the alien girl as she lay quietly, the faint hum of the medical machines filling the room. She shifted slightly, and James straightened up, his heart skipping a beat. "Lyra," he whispered, but she didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him with those intense, glowing eyes, as if trying to find the words. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice low and filled with an unexpected weight. "They left me," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. Her eyes locked onto his, and James felt a chill run down his spine. He leaned in, trying to focus on every word she spoke. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the answers he needed. "Who?" he asked, his voice gentle yet insistent. "Who left you here?" Lyra's gaze darkened, and she closed her eyes, as if the memory was too painful to face. When she spoke again, it was with a tremor in her voice. "My people, the Virexians, we were on a mission to find new worlds, new allies. But something went wrong. My ship, it was attacked." She paused, her hands clenching the bed sheets in a futile attempt to anchor herself to the present. James could feel the weight of her pain, and he reached out, placing a hand gently on hers. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "but you're safe now. You don't have to worry about them anymore." Her lips trembled, but she didn't look at him. "I wish it were that simple," she whispered, almost to herself. "They made it seem like I was expendable. A failure." Her voice cracked, and James could see the tears gathering in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "I wasn't supposed to survive. They left me to die." James felt a fire spark inside him, anger, protectiveness, and confusion all tangled together. How could anyone do that to another living being? How could they abandon her like this? His grip on her hand tightened, and he leaned in closer. "You're not a failure," he said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "You're strong, and you've survived. And I won't let anyone harm you again." Lyra finally met his gaze, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something. Perhaps it was reassurance, or maybe, for the first time, she wanted to believe in the possibility of something better. She didn't speak immediately, but she gave a small, faint nod, the tiniest flicker of hope igniting in her expression. "I don't know what's left for me," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Without my people, without my ship, I'm alone." "You're not alone," James said, almost without thinking. The words felt right, natural, and though he had no idea what his role in her survival might turn into, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to leave her behind. Not after what she'd been through. Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time since he had found her, there was a hint of trust in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The bond that had formed between them, fragile as it was, had begun to take root. She was no longer just the mysterious alien he had stumbled upon in the wasteland. She was a survivor, someone who had endured unimaginable pain and loss, someone who deserved better. James stood up slowly, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. He had no idea what the future held, what dangers lurked beyond the horizon, but he knew one thing: Lyra was no longer just an alien to him. She was a person, and whatever it took, he would protect her. "We'll figure this out," James said, his voice filled with determination. "Together." Lyra didn't respond, but the look in her eyes was enough. For the first time since they'd met, she believed him. As the night wore on, and the base settled into silence, James couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. The journey ahead would be dangerous, filled with unknowns and threats they couldn't even imagine. But one thing was certain: their paths were intertwined now, and neither of them was going to walk away from this fight. The following days brought with them a sense of urgency, a pressing need to find out more about Lyra's past and how to help her heal, both physically and emotionally. James had made a promise to her. He would protect her, and he intended to keep it. Yet, as he spent more time with her, he realized there was much more at play than a simple rescue mission. Lyra wasn't just a victim of an attack. She was the key to something much larger, something he wasn't fully prepared to face. Lyra's wounds were healing, but her mind was a different story. She had become more withdrawn, her thoughts seemingly lost in the vastness of space, trapped between her memories of betrayal and the uncertainty of her future. Yet, there were moments, brief and fleeting, when she seemed to remember who she was before the crash. These moments were the hardest for James to witness. When Lyra's eyes would suddenly shine with recognition, or when she'd speak with a newfound determination, James would catch a glimpse of the woman she once was, the warrior who had fought for her people, and the hope that had once burned brightly inside her. But those moments didn't last. Lyra would retreat again, her eyes clouding over with the pain of her past, the weight of abandonment pressing on her heart. James often found himself at a loss for what to say or do. How could he help her find herself again when he didn't fully understand the depths of her suffering? One evening, while he was on patrol outside the base, the communication system suddenly crackled to life. It was a signal, weak, distorted, but unmistakable. James's heart skipped a beat as he hurried back to the control room. There was a chance, a small one, that this was from Lyra's people, or at least someone who could offer answers. He connected the signal to the console, his fingers shaking with anticipation. The static cleared, revealing a distorted image on the screen. A voice, harsh and cold, came through the speakers. "Is this human? We've been trying to reach you for days. This is Commander Terran of the Phyrexian fleet. If you have the alien woman, you are in grave danger." James's heart pounded. Phyrexian. He had heard the name in passing, but he had no idea just how dangerous they were. Lyra's people weren't just any alien race. They were military, powerful, and now they were aware of her survival. That meant they would come for her, no matter the cost. "What do you want with her?" James demanded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear building inside him. The last thing he wanted was to anger them or make a wrong move. "You're holding a traitor," the voice growled. "She is a deserter, a failure. She has no place among us anymore. You will return her immediately, or you will suffer the consequences." The words hit James like a slap to the face. Lyra, a traitor. The woman who had fought for her people, who had been abandoned and left for dead. How could she possibly be a deserter? Before he could respond, the image flickered, and the signal was lost. James stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just heard. A deserter. No, this didn't make sense. Everything about Lyra spoke of loyalty and honor. She wasn't the enemy. He turned quickly and headed back to the medical bay. He had to tell Lyra what had happened. She deserves to know, but he also knew it might hurt her more than anything. The truth was never simple, especially when it came to her past. When James entered the room, Lyra was sitting up in bed, staring out of the window, her gaze distant. She didn't look up as he approached, as if she already knew something was wrong. "Lyra," he said gently, sitting down next to her. There was a transmission. "From your people." Her eyes flickered with interest, but she didn't say anything. "They know you're alive. They called you a traitor." At the word, Lyra's body stiffened, and she turned to face him. There was an intense, cold fury in her gaze, but it quickly softened into something more vulnerable. "I expected this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I always knew that if I survived, they would label me as a deserter. That's what they do. If you fail, if you make it out alive, they don't care what happened. They discard you." James could see the anger, the hurt, and the disbelief in her eyes, but there was something else, something deeper. "You didn't desert them," he said, almost pleading with her to believe it. "You were left behind. They abandoned you. And now they're coming for you." Lyra shook her head slowly. "It doesn't matter anymore," she murmured. "My people, they're gone. I was never meant to survive. They've written me off. I've been discarded like a piece of broken technology." She swallowed hard, and for the first time, tears started to well up in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, but James saw the pain she was trying to hide. James couldn't stand it. He reached out, placing his hand on hers. "No, you're wrong," he said fiercely. "You're not broken. You're not a failure. And I'm not letting them take you back. You're not alone anymore." Lyra's expression softened slightly, but she still looked uncertain. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice small, almost lost. "Where do I belong?" "Here," James said, his voice steady. "You belong with me. And I'm going to help you find your place again, no matter what it takes." The silence between them stretched on for a moment, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with the unspoken promise that they would face whatever came next together. Lyra didn't say anything, but the way she squeezed his hand told him everything he needed to know. They would figure this out, together. The quiet stillness that had hung over the base shattered the following morning when the ground trembled with the unmistakable sound of heavy machinery. James was up before the sun, already pacing around the perimeter of the compound, his mind racing. The Virexian fleet, he realized, wasn't waiting. They were coming fast. The transmission, which had seemed like an idle threat, now felt like a ticking bomb that was about to go off. His instinct screamed at him to prepare for the worst. The Virexians weren't known for mercy. They were relentless, efficient, and without compassion, and James had no intention of letting them take Lyra back to whatever fate awaited her in their cold, military-driven hands. He couldn't let them take her. Not after everything she had already been through. She was more than just an alien warrior. She was a person who had been abandoned and betrayed, and James couldn't allow that kind of injustice to continue. He rushed to the medical bay, where Lyra had been staying. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and he immediately saw her sitting up on the edge of the bed, already alert. She had heard the sound too, he could tell. There was a tension in her posture, a readiness that told him she hadn't just been lying down all this time waiting for him to make the next move. She was strong, stronger than he'd realized. "Lyra, we need to leave." "Now," James said, his voice urgent as he crossed the room toward her. Lyra stood immediately, her eyes hardening as she surveyed the room, her movements swift and purposeful. "I knew they wouldn't leave me alone. Not after they found out I was alive. But I don't plan on being their prisoner." James paused, surprised by the edge in her tone. She sounded calm, but there was a fire behind her words, a fierce determination that he hadn't seen before. She was ready to fight, and so was he. He would fight for her, fight for the right to choose her own future. "We don't have much time," James said, snapping out of his thoughts. He grabbed his tactical gear from the table beside the bed and quickly strapped it on. Lyra was already gathering her things, a strange, almost predatory look in her eyes as she prepared herself for whatever was coming next. The sound of the approaching Virexian ships was getting louder. James could hear the roar of their engines growing closer, and his pulse quickened with each passing second. He had known from the start that Lyra wasn't just another stranded alien. She was important, and now he understood why. The Virexians wouldn't just let her go. They would come for her with everything they had. "Are you ready for this?" James asked, his voice low, his gaze meeting Lyra's. She nodded slowly, her face set in a grim expression. "I've been ready my whole life." It was that moment, that shared understanding between them, that made everything feel more real. Lyra wasn't just some wounded survivor he had found. She was a warrior, a person with a past and a purpose. And now it was his job to make sure she had a future. They moved quickly, exiting the medical bay and heading toward the underground garage, where James had hidden a military-grade transport vehicle. He had hoped it would never come to this, but now there was no other option. The Virexians would be here soon, and there was no way they could afford to stay in one place. They had to move. As they approached the vehicle, James could feel the vibrations underfoot as the first of the Virexian ships touched down outside the compound. He had expected them to be fast, but not this fast. It was clear that they were not going to give up until they found Lyra. "You're going to have to drive," James said to Lyra, his voice firm. Lyra gave him a quick, determined nod, taking the driver's seat without hesitation. She was already familiar with human vehicles, having been trained on various forms of technology back home. She wasn't just an alien warrior. She was intelligent, resourceful, and capable in ways James hadn't fully appreciated until now. "Ready?" James asked, as he quickly jumped into the passenger seat. "Always," Lyra responded, starting the engine. The roar of the machine drowned out the noise of the approaching ships as she accelerated, pushing the vehicle to its limits. They needed speed, and they needed it now. As they sped away from the base, James could see the dark outlines of the Virexian ships landing in the distance. They were closing in on their location, but Lyra didn't slow down. She was driving with a focus and skill that surprised James, pushing the vehicle through narrow corridors and dodging obstacles as if she had been doing this her entire life. He watched her in awe, impressed by her ability to stay calm under pressure. They reached the edge of the compound, where the land opened up into a dense forest. It was their best chance for cover, and James could only pray that the Virexians wouldn't be able to track them through the trees. But as they entered the woods, the sound of pursuit followed them, relentless and close behind. James could hear the Virexian ships overhead, their engines whirring as they searched for any sign of the humans or the alien they were hunting. "This won't be easy," James muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. He wasn't sure if they'd be able to outrun the ships, but they had to try. They had no other choice. Lyra glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I never said it would be." As they navigated the dense undergrowth, the sound of their pursuers grew fainter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could escape. But James knew that this was only the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. The distant hum of the Virexian ships was now almost completely inaudible. The heavy weight of the chase seemed to ease, though the tension in the air remained thick, like the calm before a storm. James and Lyra had managed to escape into the forest, but neither of them was under any illusion about how temporary their victory might be. The Virexian forces were relentless, and no matter how fast they ran or how well they hid, they would stop at nothing to retrieve Lyra. As they drove deeper into the forest, the landscape grew more treacherous. The roads were barely visible beneath the thick undergrowth, and the terrain was increasingly rugged. But Lyra, despite her unfamiliarity with this planet's environment, drove with an innate sense of control. She knew instinctively how to maneuver through the obstacles, her alien instincts guiding her in ways James couldn't fully comprehend. "We can't keep driving like this forever," James said, his voice low and tense. He had been watching the rearview mirror obsessively, scanning for any signs of pursuit. The dark silhouette of the Virexian ships was still a haunting image in his mind. Their advanced technology made it almost impossible to stay hidden for long. "I know," Lyra replied, her focus unwavering. "We need to find a place to lie low, a place they won't find us." James nodded. "I know a safe house nearby. It's not far, but it's well hidden. I used it a few times on missions." Without another word, Lyra veered off the barely their road, her sharp gaze scanning for the slightest indication of a path. The dense woods closed in around them, the trees towering like silent sentinels, their thick trunks creating a natural fortress that could shield them from prying eyes. The vehicle's tires crunched on the gravel as they turned onto a narrow, overgrown trail that led deeper into the forest. Minutes passed in tense silence, both of them listening for the ominous sounds of the Virexian ships. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds now were the rustling of leaves and the rhythmic thrum of the engine. James kept his hand on the comms, ready to contact the safe house, but there was no sign that anyone had received their signal. The base's communication systems had been disabled in the chaos, leaving them alone, isolated, and vulnerable. As they traveled further, the trail began to ascend, leading them up a small hill that overlooked a valley below. At the top, the dense forest parted, revealing the hidden compound nestled in a secluded hollow. It was a simple structure built into the side of the mountain, camouflaged so well that even the sharpest eyes would have difficulty spotting it from above. "This is it," James said, his voice tinged with relief. "It's not much, but it'll hold up for a while." Lyra slowed the vehicle as they approached the compound, her eyes darting to the dense woods surrounding them. The place seemed like a ghost town, quiet and desolate, A perfect hiding spot in theory. Still, James wasn't about to take any chances. They needed to secure the perimeter before they could rest. They parked the vehicle inside a concealed garage, hidden behind a set of heavy, reinforced doors. James stepped out first, scanning the area before turning back to Lyra, who was already on her feet, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Stay alert," he warned her as he activated the compound security system. "It's been a while since I've been here. We don't know if anyone's been around." Lyra gave him a nod, and together they moved toward the entrance, where James quickly punched in the access code. The heavy metal door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the interior of the compound. It was a small, utilitarian space, but it was secure, reinforced walls, a simple bed, and all the equipment James would need to monitor the situation. There was even a rudimentary communications array that, with some work, could be used to contact any allies still left. The moment they entered, James activated the security monitors and checked the surrounding area. He tapped on the screen, bringing up a live feed of the outside world. The Virexian ships were still patrolling nearby, but it seemed they hadn't been able to track them this far. For the first time in hours, the weight of the chase lifted, but only slightly. There was still so much uncertainty, and James knew that the Virexians wouldn't stop hunting until they had Lyra in their hands again. As Lyra moved deeper into the compound, she took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she allowed herself a moment of peace. James could see how exhausted she was, both mentally and physically. She had been through so much already, so much more than anyone should have to endure. Yet in this quiet, hidden place, she seemed stronger, more resolute. "I didn't think I would make it this far," Lyra admitted, her voice quieter than usual, her gaze distant as she looked out the window. "They've been after me for years. But something's different this time. I feel like I might actually have a chance to stop them." James walked over to her, his expression softening. "You're not alone in this anymore," he said, his voice steady. "We'll fight this together. I won't let them take you." She met his eyes, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in her gaze. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was there, and James clung to it as though it were his lifeline. But the peace they had found was fragile, and James knew it. He could feel it in the air. The Virexians were only biding their time, and soon they would be back with more firepower than before. There was no escaping the truth. The battle was just beginning, and it would take everything they had to survive. The stillness of the hidden compound was shattered by a faint, distant hum, a hum that echoed through the air, steadily growing louder. James immediately stiffened, his senses alert. It was a sound he knew all too well. The Virexians were close, their ships likely hovering just beyond the forest's dense canopy. The time they had spent in relative safety was running out, and James knew that the calm would soon be replaced by the chaos of battle. "Lyra," he whispered urgently, his voice low but commanding. "We need to move now." She didn't hesitate. Her sharp, alien instincts flared to life, and within seconds, she was on her feet, her eyes scanning the monitors and the perimeter. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice calm despite the growing urgency in the air. James checked the readings on the security panel, watching the numbers shift rapidly as the Virexian ships closed in. "Not long. They've detected us." His heart raced, but he pushed aside the fear. There was no time for panic, no time for hesitation. They had to be smarter, faster, and more resourceful than the enemy. James turned to Lyra, his resolve firming as he spoke. "We have one shot at this. I've got an old underground tunnel system here. It leads to a hidden location far enough away from here that they might not track us immediately." Lyra nodded, understanding the urgency. She moved toward the back of the compound, her feet light and quick as she surveyed the area. James led the way to the trapdoor beneath a heavy metal panel. With a swift motion, he unlocked it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness below. They descended quickly, the air growing cooler as they entered the underground chamber. James fumbled with his flashlight, flicking it on to reveal a series of winding tunnels that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. The walls were lined with old pipes, and the air smelled musty, but it was better than the alternative, being caught by the Virexians. "Stay close," James ordered, his voice steady, but his eyes were sharp. He could feel Lyra's presence just behind him, her breathing steady but quiet. He knew she had probably experienced far worse. Her people had been through countless wars and betrayals. But this was different. This was personal. The sound of distant engines grew louder, sending a chill down James's spine. He knew the Virexians were closing in on the compound. They would search the surface, and once they realized the two of them were gone, they would scour the underground system as well. It was a race against time. As they moved deeper into the tunnels, the air grew colder and the passageways narrowed. The darkness seemed to swallow them whole, but James didn't falter. His military training had prepared him for situations like this, but he could sense the gravity of their situation. They were no longer just running. They were fighting for their survival, for Lyra's survival. And in that fight, they were alone. "We can't keep running forever," Lyra said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet but filled with a kind of quiet determination that James admired. "There has to be a way to stop them, to turn the tide." James paused, his hand resting on the wall of the tunnel as he thought. She was right. Running wasn't a permanent solution. The Virexians would catch up eventually. They always did. But what if they could do more than just hide? What if they could fight back, take the fight to them? "I've got an idea," James said, his voice suddenly filled with purpose. He turned to Lyra, meeting her eyes with a spark of something. Hope, maybe. "There's an old weapons cache near the end of this tunnel. I've used it in the past for emergencies, and this is definitely one of those." He didn't wait for a response but pressed forward, leading the way. The deeper they went into the tunnel, the more James's mind raced. The weapons cache was hidden behind a solid concrete wall, and he could only pray that the Virexians hadn't found it yet. If they had, they'd know exactly what kind of danger James and Lyra could pose. But if they hadn't, the cache could give them a fighting chance. Minutes passed in tense silence as they navigated through the narrow passageways. James could feel Lyra's presence behind him, her footsteps silent but sure. She had an intensity in her that mirrored his own, and he knew that if they were going to survive this, they would need to combine their strengths. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the hidden door. James quickly punched in the access code, the metal door slowly grinding open. The room beyond was dimly lit, filled with crates, weapon racks, and old gear from James's previous missions. His fingers brushed over the equipment, moving with practiced ease. The weapons were outdated, but they were functional. Guns, explosives, and even a few pieces of advanced tech that could give them the edge they needed. "Take what you can carry," James said, pulling out 2 weapons and handing one to Lyra. "We'll need it." Lyra nodded, grabbing a weapon and testing its weight in her hands. She was silent, but the fire in her eyes told James everything he needed to know. She wasn't just running from the Virexians anymore. She was preparing to fight. With their weapons secured, they turned to leave the cache, but before they could take another step, the sound of the Virexian ships grew deafening. The air was thick with the hum of their engines, a sign that the enemy was closing in faster than James had anticipated. The Virexians had found the compound. "We need to go now," James said, his voice low and urgent. They sprinted through the darkened tunnels, the sounds of the Virexians' search echoing through the passageways. The path ahead was clear, but the dread of being found lingered in the air. They had only moments before the enemy would arrive, and if they didn't act fast, they would be trapped. They emerged into the open, the forest's dense cover wrapping around them. The forest was their final barrier, and James knew they couldn't afford to let the Virexians find them here. They needed to disappear, to use everything they had learned about survival and outsmart their pursuers. The chase wasn't over. It was only just beginning.